Oh, hey, Roxanne.
Hello, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, good.
Good. Welcome. Glad you made it.
Yes.
Um, so Roxanne, we carved out an hour for our conversation. Is that okay with you?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Let's just figure out who's here with us right now. We've chatted on email. I'm Brandon.
Mm-hmm.
We're running a project similar to the Healthy Neighborhoods project, um, and are just looking to learn more about it, especially your experience in
Mm-hmm.
that, some of the challenges that you ran into, so just looking for more insight than what we found in the guidebook. And we'll kind of we have some questions kind of that'll take us through that process there. And if there's, of course, anything that you'd like to learn or talk with us about, we'll carve out some time for that as well.
Okay.
So why don't we just go around and introduce ourselves real quick?
Hi, I'm Julie Hettinger. I'm the health educator at the health department here in Riley County. And just a little background on our county, we're a university town, and we're also have a military base really close to us. But we're a smaller community. We have, I think, about 55,000 people that live here. So we're kind of doing some similar work that you all had done, and just looking forward to hearing from you.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Green, and I'm the director of the health department. And we are the physical agent for the grant, and actually are the community coalition, the Flint Hills Wellness Coalition, is the applicant on the grant. So we kind of collaborate that way.
We also have Damaris on the line.
I am Damaris Kunkler. I work for Thrive Allen County. Also have the Health Equity Grant, and was invited to be on the call so that I could learn more about your Healthy Neighborhoods project. So hopefully we can utilize some of those strategies in Allen County also. So thank you for letting me be here.
And I think we have Kalia on the line as well. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm driving in my car right now, so I had to call in. So I'll switch once I get back to the house. But yes, this is Kalia Sousa, and I work with Brandon, Julie, and Jennifer on a health equity grant funded by the Kansas Health Foundation. I also work at K-State Center for Engagement and Community Development and help communities with building capacity around food systems.
Great. And I'm Roxanne Carrillo Garza, as you know. I worked with public health, the public health division of Contra Costa County for about 14 years. And a majority of that time was managing the Healthy Neighborhoods Project. And during that time, I also worked on the first place-based initiative that the California Endowment did, which you probably aren't familiar with because it's a California foundation, but it was a place-based initiative called Partners for Public Health. And it was the first time the California Endowment did a long-term initiative focused on, that initiative was focused on local health departments working together with community coalitions to advance different health policy issues. And then after Healthy Neighborhoods Project, I left that project. California Endowment had started work on their second place-based initiative, which is Building Healthy Communities, which is a 10-year initiative throughout California. There's 14 sites. And that initiative, each local site decided on specific health priorities. And one was selected here in Richmond, which is in Contra Costa. So I actually left the health department in 2013 to come and manage this new place-based initiative called Building Healthy Communities.
So maybe could we spend just a couple of minutes clarifying this difference between place-based and asset-based. We started to get into it in our email, and
Right.
I'm aware that not everybody may know the difference. Would you mind?
Right. No, not at all. So Healthy Neighborhoods Project actually was funded through the tobacco prevention program within Contra Costa initially, because that was the program that had the most flexibility with its funding. And at the time, the idea was to use the asset-based community development approach that John McKnight had developed. The interesting part of that is that ABCD model, asset-based community development model, was really more supposed to be implemented more in a community level, not in a health department. So I heard through the wind that he wasn't all that happy when he found out we were implementing it in a health department, which was kind of interesting. But yeah, I mean, that's a particular organizing model that you probably know about, but it was really to land on the ground in community. We were in 6 neighborhoods to really look at health policy issues, but more from an asset-based, you know, from more of an asset-based perspective rather than, you know, a deficit model.
Right.
Sorry, somebody is knocking on my door, so that's why I'm moving, although they left.
It's like reality TV here.
Yeah, exactly. I think my staff member locked herself out of the office, so there she is. So yeah, I mean, that was the model that we embarked on, and you know, the idea was that we would work on both health department issues as well as issues that maybe started to have us looking at other external issues that were happening in the community, some of which had health department connections, and you know, some of which did not. I mean, some of the issues that we lifted up during that process actually had connections to some of the other departments within our county. So employment, human and services division department was one, and community planning, our county community planning department was a second. So that was the whole project, you know, really focused around ABCD model. Building healthy communities is really a project that the California Endowment picked 10 large outcomes, and each hub site, we're called hubs, each hub site across California went through a year-long community process to identify the top 4 priorities in each community. And so here in Richmond, it was more of a process of aligning with our base building organizations and having a series of community meetings. And here in Richmond, I think over 200 residents participated in that process. And out of that process, 4 priority areas were selected in Richmond. One was community safety, because we had a pretty high homicide rate at that time. Second was schools and neighborhoods. So equity issues connected to education, and neighborhoods was really about revitalizing public space. The third was access to quality healthcare, and they identified that prior to the Affordable Care Act being implemented. But you know, having residents have a health home was a priority that they had picked. And then the fourth was economic revitalization. And so that was looking at issues related to family and individual sustainability, financial sustainability, as well as looking at business development and some of the, you know, larger sort of economic development or even community development issues. So that's kind of the difference. One was more, you know, driven by the California endowment initially, and then by the community. And the first one through the health department was really more related to the asset-based community development model. And in that model, we had 6 neighborhoods, as I mentioned, and each neighborhood through the asset-based community development approach identified what issues were important to them. So here in West Contra Costa County, which includes the city of Richmond, we worked on environmental justice issues primarily because we're flanked by oil refineries. We also worked on alcohol beverage control or alcohol policy issues. So reducing the number of liquor stores in neighborhoods. And I think, you know, early on the project here in West County started, you know, looking at neighborhood improvements. So, you know, looking at trash and blight and those, you know, very specific sort of infrastructure and environmental issues. And then as we move forward, we worked much more on policy issues related to environmental justice and alcohol policy.
I really want to ask you and learn more about like the process and the evolution like that you that work took. But before I do, one more sort of like framing question here, which is, could you talk just briefly about like the community development approach to improving community health, and perhaps even in contrast to like a clinical model. Most of us will be familiar with that, but we'll be sharing this conversation with others who may not be. And so if you could spend a minute talking about that, it'd be cool.
So community development in terms of?
Well, thinking about the Healthy Neighborhoods Project as a community
Right.
development approach.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing that we learned was that the asset-based community development project was really, I think, successful in building the capacity of small groups of, we called them community health advocate teams. So for each neighborhood, we had groups of 10 to 15 community health advocates that went through the whole process. So canvassed their neighborhood, went door to door asking folks what their perspective was, and we used that opportunity for them to engage with their neighbors and block, the folks that lived on their block as a way to both lift up what the issues were for those neighborhoods, but also to begin to create a platform, if you will, of issues that we could then meet with the larger neighborhood group on. And we used it as a way to do community organizing. So it was the first time I think the health department worked on a project where we essentially were organizing residents. And so I had, at the time I had community health advocates, but that became the leads of their neighborhoods. So I had 2 residents in each neighborhood that really served as the leaders for their neighborhood area and would host their own monthly meetings. And like I said, it was the first time, and I don't think since the project sort of sunsetted in 2009, the health department, thought that it would be able to sustain that work, that community level of work. And in fact, I remember talking to the public health director at the time and saying, if you disband our project, you're not going to be able to do the same level of work. And he said, no, 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 you know, we're going to deploy your staff in other parts of our community wellness program or clinic nursing or other places, and we'll continue the work. But they weren't able to, because as you probably know, it was very time intensive. So the community health advocates that I had were initially consultants. We were all consultants, being paid as consultants to the health department. So there was an organization, Public Health Institute, which actually was our employer of record. By midway through the project, I was able to get most of my community health or neighborhood health advocates into entry-level community health outreach worker positions. So the entry-level civil service classification for public health. And so all of my resident leaders, with the exception of one who didn't have a GED, I was able to move them from consultant positions to entry-level health department positions. And so that was an important thing, right? Because we were not only building the capacity of residents to work on health policy issues that were of importance to their neighborhoods, but we were also building the capacity of them to consult with the health department, right? And consult with other city and even regional policy level organizations and agencies. So when we would have, you know, community forums on environmental justice, they were interacting with our air quality management district or with the city or with the county hazmat, you know, team. So, you know, it was, I think, an important set of steps that I took to not only get the project up and running and hire them and give them stipends initially and a salary initially, a temporary salary, but to actually get them into the health department. And I think, you know, now Contra Costa County is involved, and you all may be involved in the Governing for Alliance for Racial Equity, which is a national project that's working on health equity. And the first thing that the health department, I heard last week, is going to be working on is personnel policies. And so, I mean, I do think that as we do this equity work, you know, how do we create a pathway for particularly resident leaders who we are training to be health advocates? So anyway, that I think was very important, as well as the issues that they were lifting up in each of their communities. So for Richmond, where I still work, you know, the work on environmental justice was critical, because we were not only lifting up the health concerns as a result of being communities that were, you know, right up against not only the refineries on one side, but a huge, you know, interstate on the other side. So there was high rates of asthma and other things. So we were able to get some significant policy wins out of that work. And what was interesting in the project was we started, as I said, working on neighborhood improvements, you know, like having sidewalks, you know, have painted curbs, you know, for no loitering around the liquor stores, or a mailbox, federal mailbox being, you know, put on a corner, or speed bumps, and, you know, kind of the infrastructure, basic sort of needs. But it was by the third year of the project, we were really starting to work on longer term health policy issues. And by the fifth and sixth year, the Bay Area as a region was looking at, health departments were looking at sort of the built environment and the interplay of the built environment and health. And my teams by then were ready to, you know, enter into some of those conversations with the health department, who was trying to figure out, okay, how do we begin to have health department staff around sort of the city planning tables where the built environment discussion was happening. So, I mean, I think, you know, it was a long, I mean, it took a long time to kind of move through each of those steps and to build the capacity of residents. And then, of course, the recession hit, and the health department had a hard time figuring out how it was going to sustain our effort within public health. But I do think during those years, you know, those residents were able to engage in conversations about even health department issues such as alcohol and other drugs division, which is now folded into our behavioral health division, you know, about the kind of services that were available or were not available in communities and what was actually relevant to some of the neighborhoods about services. We were able to have chronic disease strategies where we had kitchen table, you know, discussions with residents in neighborhoods about chronic disease prevention, and what infrastructure issues were sort of leading to chronic disease issues. So when we looked at condition of housing and mold and those kinds of things, teams in some of the neighborhoods were able to lift up some of the issues that they were facing, and we were starting to identify, you know, how they could advocate effectively to landlords in their neighborhood. We were looking at public community policing issues in some of the neighborhoods and how to have conversations with the city police departments that they lived in. I mentioned alcohol policy and environmental justice. We had gotten some funding from the Women's Foundation here, San Francisco Women's Foundation, to work on transportation issues, and had, you know, assembled a group of women leaders in one neighborhood to talk about the fact that they didn't have adequate transportation to get to our main county hospital, and how there were cultural issues between the bus riders and the bus drivers, you know, them being irritated that they had to get strollers on buses. And we were able actually in the end to get a bias training for some of the drivers, and we were able to get a better route from some of these neighborhoods to our county hospital. So, I mean, there was a real diverse set of, I think, issues, and we made sure that we really did lift up kind of the issues that those neighborhood residents felt were critical to them. And the beautiful thing about asset-based community development is, I don't know if you're familiar with the process, but you know, you do the door-to-door canvassing, you come back, you organize a community meeting, you put all the issues up on a sticky cloth, and then you set about lumping and splitting the issues according to how people in the neighborhood feel they're connected. And then you, in a very practical way, look at what are the assets of that neighborhood and how do you begin to connect the assets of the neighborhood to the issues that they've identified, and then begin to prioritize that. So for alcohol policy issues, you know, when they were looking at that issue in a neighborhood, I remember we had a number of the elders of the neighborhood in the room, and they said, you know, we were talking about boycotting the liquor stores, that there was a lot of homicides in and around those liquor stores. There was mostly tobacco, alcohol, and other bad things happening. And some of the residents who were maybe younger were saying, let's just boycott those liquor stores. And they were like, no, that's not going to work, because it's mostly young folks that go to those liquor stores. So how do we need to move more tactically and strategically around this issue? And because we sat in the health department, it was, you know, it was a good issue for me to then go back to the health department and reach out to my colleagues within the health department, and say, okay, you know, your alcohol beverage control, your alcohol and other drugs division, how can you interact with this team? And the director at the time was like, that's great. We're trying to do programs around tobacco, around alcohol. They had programs where they were sending in, folks to look at licensing issues. But they had the relationship with alcohol beverage control, for example, out of Oakland. So we began to navigate that whole world, train up the residents who were going to work on it. And we ended up doing license suspensions. And we had direct contact with alcohol beverage control investigators in doing some of that work. Where we ran into a snag was our own county planning department didn't want to do administrative hearings around the land use regulations related to the liquor stores. And I remember us getting sort of called on the carpet from that director, who was like, who's this renegade group out of, health services, organizing these residents. It would have been good if we could have engaged the planning department, because then we could have looked at regulations, both as it related to the alcohol license and the land use issues related to liquor stores. But it was really powerful to use this approach, because I think when you do approach the community in terms of what assets do they have, how are they experts in really looking at the health issues impacting their neighborhood, it was a powerful thing. And we did have a number of, I think, policy wins that I don't think the health department would have been able to forge. And I still see those advocates in the community. Some of them are still working on municipal advisory councils or neighborhood councils, or have been employed by local organizations. So I think our work was solid during that time. It was just hard to sustain.
Right. I'd like to back up a minute here too, and obviously a critical component of the work is building the capacity of the advocates and putting together this action team, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about what it was like going into a neighborhood and putting together an action team?
Yeah, I mean, I think the canvassing was the first step, and you got to figure out during that canvassing who kind of had a fire in their belly, right? Who, if you're talking to somebody at their front door or in their neighborhood, if they're walking in the neighborhood, like who, residents were able to assess kind of who, or maybe a handful of residents who they could bring together as a small team. So we really depended on the residents themselves to identify those initial leaders of the team. The reality of it is, you're only able to get, 10 to 15 people in any one given neighborhood to be consistent in working on this kind of effort, because it really requires a lot of their time. And I mean, it was really important for us to provide them with stipends. So I think I was trying to recall what we gave them, but I think it was like $100 every couple of months. We would give them a stipend or an honorarium, and we actually gave them, we didn't give them gift cards initially. We gave them checks so that they could purchase what they needed. What I learned from that experience is it's important really to set up those agreements in a very careful way. So receiving the stipend or the funding from us required that they actively not only participate in meetings, but actually take on a set of activities related to whatever project that they were working on. The other thing, because you're working in neighborhoods where people are chronically unemployed, and there are substance abuse issues in the neighborhoods, it almost became the stipend, even though it was very small, became something that they really depended on. And I know we're still trying to balance that in this project, right? Like, how do you pay resident leaders for their time? Because their time is just as valuable as any other. And how, I think now what I'm doing now in my current project is now we're looking more intentionally about the pathway. So as you are developing resident leadership, what is your intentionality around a pathway for those folks to then actually gain employment? And that could be through community health centers in your community, or the health department, depending on the process you have for your entry-level positions, or nonprofit organizations and partners in your community. But had I known then what I know now, I think I would have created a more intentional pathway for folks. And I would have figured out a way to help that one advocate get his GED. He was fairly resistant though, but how I was proud though that we were able to get a majority of them health services positions. But yeah, I mean, I think, and then the 10 residents, they're going to ebb and flow somewhat, but we pretty much had a consistent team of 10 to 15 folks.
Roxanne, can you talk about one of the things that I think we've talked about challenges is the residents, while some may be unemployed, others may want to be engaged, but because they're juggling kids and jobs, maybe 2 or 3 jobs, transportation, they don't necessarily have the time. So can you talk about how you either stuck to your guns about you have to attend 50% of meetings, or how you allowed for concessions, made concessions there? How did you deal with their commitment to other things, and how did you make that balance?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. Well, obviously, all of the meetings happen in the evening that they had held, and weekends for any community forums. We provided some childcare, particularly for the events. But we also started to build sort of the capacity of residents to sort of do, I'm thinking co-op, but for some reason I'm not, how could some parents, take the role of watching over other parents' kids, those kinds of things, so that it would free parents up. I also, my lead organizers, so I had lead organizers as well as the 10 to 15 neighborhood health advocates. I would free up time for my lead advocates to do things like take their residents to a healthcare appointment, for example. Or as we worked in the Latino community in Bay Point, which is the East Contra Costa County area, as we did more capacity building with a group of women around transportation, it turned out that many of them had, or a good number of them had domestic violence issues that were being exacerbated by the fact that they were learning how to become leaders. So we had to then figure out kind of pathways for them to get help around the domestic violence issues. So I had mentioned substance abuse as well. We helped one of our neighborhood health advocates start a Nar-Anon meeting out of one of our community clinics located in the neighborhood. So, I mean, I think you have to have enough flexibility in your mind. I mean, usually people think about childcare or having meetings in the evening or providing stipends. But beyond that, these folks are dealing with a myriad of issues, employment, substance abuse, domestic violence. And you sort of have to be nimble and allow your lead advocates to, not case manage, but at least, connect them in appropriate ways when those issues pop up.
So would it be fair to say that you kind of took care of the people not so that they could help you, but you helped them take care of themselves?
Correct. Yeah. And it wasn't easy to explain to the community wellness and prevention director, for example. Like they were like, well, you know, why is this staff person like cutting out at 3? And what is that? Why is she doing that? And I was like, well, you know, she had to take one of our neighborhood health advocates to, you know, Contra Costa Regional Medical Center, you know, and that was important so that she, you know, could make sure her family was safe, you know, healthy so that she could attend, you know, a community action 2 weeks from then. So yeah, I mean, you do have to, you know, allow for some flexibility there.
Could you talk, if I originally was asking about, or interested in learning about how you went about building their capacity, and obviously there's lots of different things involved in there. You know, I noticed community organizing training and team building and these kinds of things. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest issue is helping them understand systems, right? So we had, I know, a team in North Richmond and that had the issue of, and this was actually part of Partnership for Public Health, but we had a discussion about how the local county clinic was only open for shortened amount of hours, right? Because it's actually a clinic that was built from the ground up because one of our chemical companies had an accident, a release, and sent several of the residents to the hospital. And as part of the settlement from that, a health center was built. But the center only operated not at full hours, right? It wasn't meant to be an emergency room. It was, they only had the clinic open for maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 hours a week. So the community said, we need more than that. You know, we're isolated. We need more time to be able to drop into this clinic, and it's in our neighborhood and we're isolated. So a lot of the time we spent was helping them understand how the ambulatory care system worked, right? And the fact that this clinic was actually had staff that was being shared by the larger community, the larger county clinic that's in this area. And so the doctors and the nurses, you know, actually spent most of their time at this larger clinic and would spend additional hours, or, you know, as part of their hours, would spend a smaller amount of time at this community clinic. And so to get them to understand kind of how those systems work and help them navigate who they would actually meet with to discuss this issue and what they would probably hear, you know, from that member of our ambulatory care senior management team, and how they could successfully negotiate that took a lot of time. So beyond, I think, you know, community organizing or team building, how do the systems actually work? What are the implications of the policies that are in place? And how can they negotiate those or navigate those in a way that's going to be successful to them? Now, because this model was sitting inside of a health department, I couldn't use the traditional community organizing strategy, right, of the target, particularly with the health department, right, because I was a health department employee. So I also spent a concerted amount of time, and so did my staff, prepping the systems folks that they would be interacting with. So we would meet with the director of ambulatory care and say, look, this is the issue emanating out of this neighborhood, out of this community. This is what their concerns are, and they want to meet with you on this day between these hours, and we need you to be able to answer in real time what you could do. We know all the things you can't do, but what are some things that you could come to the table and negotiate with these residents on? And so you have to prepare both the systems folks and the residents on the policy itself, the issues and constraints that systems will most likely come to you with, and where is there some play, you know, there. I mean, how can you push the system to move beyond those constraints if that's possible? But also you know, train and prep the systems folks, because particularly the environmental justice issues were rough because it was a clash of cultures, right? The folks leading environmental justice policy work at the city or the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, they were used to just coming and being on a panel and discussing, you know, their work in a way that most community members didn't understand. And then community would get up and provide testimony that was passionate and, you know, spoke to the health issues they were experiencing, but it fell on deaf ears with the systems because they didn't know how to react to it. So, I mean, I think we had to learn how to prepare on both sides. And then at least for the environmental justice work, we flipped the script. So we would start community forums by having a panel of residents discuss the issues and have the policymakers in the audience. And then we would have the policymakers join the residents in a dialogue. Because you were dealing with clash of cultures and language, you know, bureaucratic language versus community language, and you were dealing with power, right? Dynamics.
Can you talk how much of the language you use in the organizing work that you did included the conception of power? I mean, that's just like a really concept, and so I wonder, you know, to what extent, you know, you use that.
Yeah, we used it. I think where it came in rough, I'm remembering the alcohol policy work. We actually have one of our county supervisors, chief of staff was in the room with us one day, and we had a organizing meeting, and we said, you know, who has the power to make decisions on these liquor stores? And we knew that the supervisor actually did. And so we said, well, you know, in this case, your targets are the supervisor, ABC, alcohol beverage control, and community planning, and the owners themselves. And boy, the chief of staff took that back to the local supervisor. And they initially weren't all that happy, but that was years ago. I think the supervisor is, you know, much more aware of how we do the work now. But yeah, I mean, we use the language of community organizers, so targets and allies and all of that. But you know, I mean, I think the organizers that I worked with at the time said, you know, Roxanne, you are a health department employee, and so the balance for you is you have to be honest with both the community, meaning you have to be honest about what you can and cannot do, you know, and what information that you have, and be open about that. But also you need to be just as honest with the hierarchy of the health department. Like, you know, there's no surprises in the health department or planning department or the supervisor's office, you know. And he reminded me, you know, county government is paramilitary, you know, and in terms of how the generation of the evolution of the hierarchy from the beginning of government. So I had to be really clear with, you know, my chain of command. And, you know, the health department director used to see us every now and then and say, oh, here are my troublemakers, you know, and they knew that if they heard from the city mayor of a particular city, or they heard from a regulatory agency, they knew the context of the work that we were doing, and you know, we'd have to figure out how to respond to those issues. But so I would say it was community organizing, but we also had to be conscious of the fact that we were doing that within the context of a health department.
And I'm also curious, you know, in how your role kind of evolved over time, but particularly, you know, here our model we're basing it largely off the Healthy Neighborhoods model, but we don't have hired community organizers in different neighborhoods. We're really in one neighborhood right now, and our coordinator is the organizer in the Healthy Neighborhoods language. And so we don't have like that extra organizer that lives in the neighborhood, right? And so we're working directly with neighborhood health advocates. And I imagine at some point, you know, you get to a place where you're kind of, you know, you're trying to figure out where your work as the organizer ends and the advocate's work begins. And can you talk about like where that line has been for you?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it was interesting within our department. We started in the community wellness and prevention program, as I mentioned, and in particular tobacco. But during the course of our project, we actually moved out of underneath community wellness and prevention and moved right under the public health director. And that was intentional, right? Because within community wellness and prevention, it did put them in a precarious position at times. So when we were politically, and then the type of funding that we were trying to seek after a while was much more focused on the organizing work, and it made it more difficult to be under that program within public health. So we actually lobbied really hard to sit right underneath the public health director. So we created our own unit called Public Health Outreach and Education Committee or group. But we moved under the public health director to mitigate some of the political issues related to the work that we were doing. And then in terms of kind of where our role ended, I mean, I think once you build the capacity of residents to do the work, to identify the issues and to recruit other residents to participate, they came up with their own sort of strategies on how they wanted to represent their neighborhoods. I don't know that it's as clean as, you know, where our role left off and where theirs began, because they needed support to do all of that work.
Sure.
And so I would say the coordinator and the lead advocates in each neighborhood, you know, had to be in close communication. But I think where we drew the line is we had to be careful with, you know, obviously California law, I'm sure in your state, around how far we could go with political lobbying and legislative lobbying. We steered clear of that. We did make sure that we were on, you know, the line was education. So we use the word education a lot. So like if there was a ballot initiative, there was back then, where California was going to incarcerate young folks, instead of in the juvenile justice system, in the prison system, based on whatever crimes they were committing across California. We did have our team go out and provide education on that ballot initiative. Unfortunately, it passed in California, and unfortunately, you know, a lot of folks who were beset with a lot of violence happening in their neighborhoods actually thought it was a good ballot initiative. But we did do a number of education campaigns, but that was the sort of distinction.
Good. Yeah. We have about 7 minutes left if we're going to stick to our time boundary here. So I'll open it up in case Damaris or Kalia have any questions, or anybody else as well.
I'm curious about when you said you did canvassing. What did you say when you knocked on the door?
So it was we actually had our public health evaluator, epidemiologist, actually used a model out of Aspen. There was a whole long survey that we used. And I can look and see if I still have that on some thumb drive somewhere. But we actually used a pretty lengthy community survey. And it was everything from, you know, what did they see as the positive aspects of their neighborhood to, you know, and what were some of the issues in their neighborhood, to what types of skills did they have. So were they a comadre in the neighborhood? Did they plan parties in their neighborhood, or were they an active member of one of the 6 local churches in the neighborhood, so that we could begin to actually track their skill sets in a way that was comfortable for them. And then we actually had a date already in hand when we would show up to people's doors. So like, we are planning a neighborhood meeting on this date. Would you be willing to come? So it was a pretty big data set that we walked away from. They went with clipboards and pens at the time. Now people have iPads, although not everybody can afford iPads. So we're going to probably go out with clipboards for another project in the next 6 months. But yeah, I mean, they collected pretty intensive data, probably 4 pages of questions that we asked.
Kalia or Damaris, excuse me. Any questions for Roxanne?
Hey, you have me, Damaris.
What?
I just really want to say thank you for all that information. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, now we can.
Okay. Thank you. I took a lot of notes, and really thank you for, I mean, it kind of validates some of the work that we've been doing, and it reiterates the things that are important and that's really just that word intentional, Brandon, that you had talked about before too, that intentional empowerment. I like the pathways part of it. So I want to maybe talk to you more about what that meant. I mean, it really meant to you that you raise those residents from taking them from one point to the next point there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, you know, we're creating sort of our own strategy for the current project I'm working on. But I think, you know, what we're now looking at is how many residents can we get on county and city and school district commissions, advisory boards. Are there leaders who have been involved in those venues who can run for school board? Are there, you know, I know probably in your state we have local organizations who do boards and commissions trainings for residents. For us, it's Urban Habitat does that for us here out of Oakland. But we're looking at how they can modify those curriculums to meet the needs of entry-level residents, and then, you know, career path them beyond that. And then the other model that we're using is out of UC Berkeley. UC Berkeley has a program out of cities and schools called Y Plan. And they work with young people to be consultants for clients in community. So BART, which is our mass transit, may have a problem that they want community to solve, and young people, you know, came together, did research, did some data collection, and then provided feedback to BART on their issue. We're actually looking at that model for adults as well. How can adults serve as consultants to our cities? So we just finished a pilot with our first group of adults, and they consulted with the city of Richmond on bus shelters and providing Wi-Fi at bus shelters, and what do residents need or want in terms of that Wi-Fi. And they did a fantastic job and just presented to the city manager and to our transit organization, to the IT department of the city. And the city says they're going to take on a number of the recommendations that the residents have presented, and they're going to hire them back to continue consulting with them. So I think there's a number of models now that are leading to this pathway work that are worth pursuing as it relates to the Healthy Neighborhoods Project.
I'll just add one thing at the end. I really appreciate everything that you talked about. I'm a community development practitioner, so everything that you're saying is really resonating with the principles of community development that we talk about. And you actually touched on one of the questions I wanted to ask about, which was engaging, I guess you would say, unusual voices in the process, like youth. But even more specifically, can you talk very quickly a little bit about volunteer engagement and retention? So even beyond the neighborhood health advocates, getting the community involved at a wider level.
Yeah, I mean, that's the trick. And I think, you know, with Latino communities, they're working 4 jobs, many of the families, and, you know, it's really difficult given the climate of our country to get them to come out lately. But I think providing, we used to call it sort of a ladder of participation in the health department. I'm sure you've seen the spectrum of prevention kind of ladder that actually came out of Contra Costa Health Services as well. And now Children's Prevention Institute, or the Prevention Institute, also has that as a tool. But I think providing residents with a number of different options. So they may just come out to a community event where you're talking about a health issue. They may be willing to talk with their neighbors, but they can't, you know, go beyond that. They may be willing to participate in the monthly neighborhood action team meetings, but giving people a variety. Some have really good communication skills, and of course now social media is the biggest issue. Like, we're looking at how are we going to get a group of residents together to translate this work into language that makes sense for community, right? Because we use language out of out of government, out of foundation speak, and much of it doesn't resonate with the average resident walking down the street. So I think having the group of residents actually come up with their own messaging around whatever they're working on, and then being able to post it themselves on social media is what we're interested in now, because that's, you know, and then I just think, you know, yeah. So I think giving them a variety of roles, but then being really clear on those levels of participation and who's going to take on what assignment.
Okay, thank you. And that last little piece about the communications was especially good, in being able to translate across multiple audiences and letting that meaning making be in the hands of the residents. I'm glad that you did that too.
Because whenever we use our language, I mean, it's so hard to understand. I mean, even for us sometimes. And then I think celebration, the other thing we're looking at, I'll just end by saying celebration. So we're having a parent convening this Saturday, and it's totally parent-led. We're going to have parents who have been organizing in their neighborhood or community for long periods of time tell stories about their work. We're going to have newer leaders who are just learning about the work, share what their experience is, and we're just going to celebrate. There's no training, there's no, you know, organizations are being invited, but we're just to stand along the perimeter of the event and observe and support. But I think celebration is critical at that level. Like, how do we celebrate the work that folks are doing and let them plan how they want to celebrate?
Roxanne, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We've gone over. We want to carve out time for you to ask us any questions that you might be interested in as well. And if this isn't a good time to do that, I'd be happy to talk to you at another time as well.
Yeah, I mean, the only question I had was like structurally, where do you all sit? Are you within public health, or where are you structurally?
Well, the grant funded work that we're doing kind of sits in two places, but we applied as a coalition that does not have 501c3 status yet. But obviously made us very competitive, more competitive, I think, probably for doing this kind of work. And the grant is managed by the health departments, where we are in this window right now. And frankly, the coalition would not exist right now if the health department wasn't involved, because it's all administered by really the people in this room. And so it's kind of like both of those organizations right now.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think that was sort of the idea of the public partnership for public health as well. We had a coalition outside of the health department, and then we, in the health department would interface with that coalition. And there was funding going to both to participate. That was how but that was coming from the California Endowment, which is a little different.
Right.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay. Well, anytime, if you want to follow up on anything as you're evolving your project, feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much, Roxanne. Much appreciated.
You're welcome. Bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.